I first began experiencing these disturbing semi-lucid nightmares when I was barely old enough to roll out of my crib and into bed. And they continued for nearly 4 years, an inexorable cycle of fear that no amount of childlike innocence could ever completely erase. In each of these replays, I found myself in the familiar space of my own bedroom, but surprisingly, not from within. Instead, I was hovering near the ceiling, as if I were an invisible camera mounted high above, my small body below looking impossibly small against the rumpled sheets. That sense of disembodied disorientation was pure terror. How wrong it was to occupy 2 places at once, drifting above a sleeping child who should have been me but wasn't. Even with the vague awareness that this was just a dream, that no intruders had broken in and I was actually safely tucked under the covers, my heart pounded as if my ribs were straining to escape, and every instinct screamed that I was dangerously exposed. The first inevitable oddity was always the digital clock on the nightstand. Its numbers steadily counting down instead of forward, 1:02 fading in reverse to 1:01. Then 1 o'clock, then sinking lower until it reached some inhuman time like 12:59. And so on, each reverse tick echoing in my mind like a metronome of unease. I would pull my eyes to the left, hoping that I could get the clock to move normally again, but the numbers would simply stubbornly flip back, refusing to be corrected by my childish willpower. That upside-down clock was my anchor to the unreality of what I was seeing. Unshakable evidence that my world had been quietly turned upside down while I slept. Only when I stared at that impossibility long enough to feel panic curl my toes, did my gaze drift to the next disturbing image. Crayon drawings pasted in random spots on walls, dressers, and even closet doors. These crude, childish scribbles featured a row of stick figures holding hands, each face painted with an exaggerated grin, except for one significantly smaller figure whose smile was slightly more timid. Always the same configuration, always the same thin strokes of color, and always, without fail, a house in the background with a roof painted an unnaturally vivid shade of blue. I was the smaller figure. I knew, but I had never drawn these pictures. Nor could I remember when they first appeared. I was not the kind of child who drew, and certainly not in such a specific, repetitive way, yet, in that dream, I would follow each little face with my eyes, desperate to see if I recognized my own childish shape, hoping that somehow the image might explain itself or disappear if I looked long enough. But the line of cheerful strangers never faded, and the little house with the blue roof taunted me with its silent, known eternity. Finally, with my mind reeling from the inverted clock and the anonymous family portrait on the wall, I noticed another incongruity, an old toy train parked on the floor in a new location, running silently across the old carpet, as if it had memorized a route that only it could follow. The most devastating part was that I had lost that very train in real life about 2 years ago. And in my waking hours I never dared to hope that it would reappear. But in my dreams it roamed freely in various locations night after night, as if to remind me that dreams need not respect reality. Standing guard over these impossible details was the bedroom window, which beckoned with an almost magnetic pull, a pull so compelling that I would turn my disembodied head toward it, eyes wide, breath quickening in my throat. And there, motionless just beyond the glass, would stand a solitary figure. Sometimes he was visible in the moonlight, sometimes only the faintest reflection of his gray hair and the glint of an old scar or cut on his temple betrayed his presence. But he never spoke. He looked at me, perfectly still, for a few seconds, long enough to feel his cold knuckles gripping my spine, before raising his hand. Fingers splayed across the glass, as if testing the barrier that held him there. And always, at that exact moment, I would bolt upright, heart racing, palms slippery, my own bedroom a cruel mirror of the dream, empty, silent, no trains on the floor, no graffiti on the walls, no countdown clock. Still, I'd stumble to the window and press my trembling hands to the glass, searching for the slightest smudge or footprint that would prove I hadn't imagined it, only to find the glass clean, as if the dream had scrubbed the world clean behind me. This cycle, floating without a body, witnessing the defiant signs of the impossible, feeling the weight of an invisible watcher, returned every 2 or 3 months. As inexorable as the tide, until I finally confided in my parents. Their pragmatic reassurances and midnight patrols did little to assuage the deep terror I felt in that dream world. But it took another year before I dared to share all its contours. And while the nightmares eventually subsided and gave way to the normal fading of childhood fear, the memory of that disembodied terror, the clock ticking backward, the silent train, the innocent family of crayons, and the man pressing his cut scar into my window, remained as a reminder that dreams need not respect reality. Standing guard over these impossible details was the bedroom window, which beckoned with an almost magnetic pull, a pull so compelling that I would turn my disembodied head toward it. Eyes wide, breath quickening in my throat, and there, motionless just beyond the glass, would stand a solitary figure. Sometimes he would be visible in the moonlight. Other times only the faintest reflection of his graying hair and the glint of an old scar or cut on his temple betrayed his presence. But he never spoke. He looked at me, perfectly still, for a few seconds, long enough to feel the cold knuckles of his gaze gripping my spine, before raising his hand. Fingers splayed across the glass, as if testing the barrier that held him there. And always, at that exact moment, I would bolt upright, heart racing, palms slippery, my own bedroom a cruel mirror of the dream scene, empty. Silent. No trains on the floor. No drawings on the walls. No countdown clocks. Still, I would stumble to the window and press my trembling hands to the cool glass, searching for the slightest smudge or footprint that might prove I hadn't imagined it. Only to find the glass spotless, as if the dream had washed the world away from me. This cycle, floating without a body, witnessing the defiant signs of the impossible, feeling the weight of an invisible watcher, repeated every 2 or 3 months. As inexorably as the tide, until I finally confided in my parents. Their pragmatic reassurances and midnight patrols did little to assuage the profound terror I felt in that dream world. But it would be another year before I dared to share all its contours. And while the nightmares eventually subsided and gave way to ordinary childhood fear, the memory of that disembodied terror, the clock ticking backward, the silent train, the innocent family of crayons, and the man pressing his cut scar into my window, remained as if to remind me that dreams need not respect reality. Standing guard over these impossible details was the bedroom window, which beckoned with an almost magnetic pull, a pull so compelling that I would turn my disembodied head toward it. Eyes wide, breath quickening in my throat, and there, motionless just beyond the glass, would stand a lone figure. Sometimes he would emerge in the moonlight. Other times only the faintest reflection of his gray hair and the glint of an old scar or cut on his temple betrayed his presence. But he never spoke. He would look at me, perfectly still, for a few seconds, long enough to feel the cold knuckles of his gaze gripping my spine, before raising his hand. Fingers splayed across the glass, as if testing the barrier that held him there. And always, at that exact moment, I would spring to my feet, heart racing, palms slippery, my own bedroom a cruel mirror of the dream scene, empty. Silent. No train on the floor. No drawings on the walls. No countdown clock. Still, I would stumble to the window and press my trembling hands to the cool glass, searching for the slightest smudge or footprint that might prove I had not imagined it. Only to find the glass spotless, as if the dream had washed the world clean behind me. This cycle, floating disembodied, witnessing the defiant signs of the impossible, feeling the weight of an invisible watcher, returned every 2 or 3 months. As inexorably as the tide, until I finally confided in my parents. Their pragmatic reassurances and midnight patrols did little to assuage the profound terror I felt in that dream world. But it would be another year before I dared to share all its contours. And while the nightmares eventually subsided and gave way to normal childhood fears, the memory of that disembodied horror, the clock ticking backwards, the silent train, the innocent family of crayons, and the man pressing his cut scar into my window, left a lasting impression. Still, I would stumble to the window and press my trembling hands to the cool glass, searching for the smallest smudge or footprint that might prove I hadn't imagined it. Only to find the glass spotless, as if the dream had washed the world clean behind me. This cycle, floating disembodied, witnessing defiant signs of the impossible, feeling the weight of an invisible watcher, returned every 2 or 3 months. As inexorably as the tide, until I finally confided in my parents. Their pragmatic reassurances and midnight patrols did nothing to assuage the profound terror I felt in that dream world. But it would be another year before I dared to share all its contours. And while the nightmares eventually subsided and gave way to ordinary childhood fear, the memory of that disembodied horror, the clock ticking backward, the silent train, the innocent family of crayons, and the man pressing his cut scar into my window, left a lasting impression. Still, I stumbled to the window and pressed my trembling hands to the cool glass, searching for the slightest smudge or footprint that might prove I hadn't imagined it, only to find the glass spotless, as if the dream had washed the world away from me. This cycle, floating without a body, witnessing the defiant signs of the impossible, feeling the weight of an invisible watcher, returned every 2 or 3 months, as inexorable as the tide, until I finally confided in my parents. Their pragmatic reassurances and midnight patrols did little to assuage the profound terror I felt in that dream world. But it would be another year before I dared to share all its contours. And while the nightmares eventually subsided and gave way to ordinary childhood fears, the memory of that disembodied terror, the clock ticking backwards, the silent train, the innocent family of crayons, and the man pressing his cut scar into my window, left a lasting impression. As the clock on the nightstand ticked backwards, fading into the background, the next thing I always saw in my dreams were the seemingly perfectly rational doodles. The white candles in every corner of the room. In the yellow light of my dreams, scraps of white paper were scattered around the wardrobe, the edge of the night, and even fluttering on the ceiling, as if the painter had wanted me. A white deer child holding a crayon, to see wherever I looked. The simple, orphaned drawings were sharp, showing a line of people linked by hands, smiling widely in crayon, looking innocent and dreamy. In the middle of the group of characters, there was always a smaller figure for sure. I recognized my style, big round head, body size, arms and legs in scribbled lines. The roof could not be mistaken for anyone else but myself. I strained my eyes to find a change, hoping that today the picture would be different. But the smile remained the same, magically solid behind the crayons. Behind them, there always appeared a house with a green roof, its square shape standing out against the gray background. Peace, in my dream, was so blue that it bothered me. I felt like the whole sky was about to fall down, erasing everything around. Every time I wake up, my heart beats. Yet, among those doodles, I always catch sight of another figure, the dirty hull of a train. Have a cold, Faith. There is an accurate sense of touch reflected in the many times I have tried to put myself in the shoes of the dreams. I can still feel the weight of that moment as if I were standing at the foot of my childhood bed again. The room bathed in the faint light of a late summer moon. I know now that this recurring dream always led to the same terrifying climax, the silent appearance of the window keeper. But in those early years, I never knew exactly what would happen, only that, at some point, my semi-conscious mind would turn toward the window. And everything I thought I understood about safety and home would. It would happen after I convinced myself I was safe again, after I stared at the strange countdown clock. After I ran my trembling fingers over the family of crayon-scrawled stick figures and the little toy train that sparkled in the dim light. My pulse would slow as I reassured myself that it was just a dream. That tomorrow morning I would wake up to sunlight on the blankets and no sign of. Then I felt it. An almost magnetic pull toward the window. In the real world, I would climb into bed and stare at the night sky, counting stars or wondering what the neighbor's cat was doing. But in the dream, I couldn't help myself. I tilted my head. I watched, my heart pounding like an emergency alarm. There, pressed against the window frame, was the figure. At first I couldn't make out the details. He was a block of obsidian against the gray night, as if the darkness itself had taken shape. Then, when lightning flashed outside, always just as the wind picked up, the moonlight would catch his chin. And I'd catch a glimpse of short, silver hair and a long, jagged scar on his left temple. It curved from temple to scalp like a wounded clump on an ancient tree. So vivid it looked painted on. I'd shiver, half afraid that the next flash would reveal him smiling, his eyes shining with something unholy. Instead, that moment of recognition, the flash of lightning illuminating the stranger's face, was the deepest fear I had ever known. My entire body would stiffen as if frozen in ice. and every fiber of my being would scream that I was not the only one in the room. Yet somehow, I couldn't look away. I would see his hands, pressed against the glass, fingers spread like claws. The glass would glisten with the condensation from him. My dream. Then, always suddenly, I would wake up with a start. But there was never anything, no bloody traces, no claw marks, no wet glass. During my waking hours, I became extremely aware of the windows everywhere I went. Transparent. When I finally told my parents, I spoke so quietly I barely recognized them. They responded with gentle logic. Dreams can repeat. My mother said, tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear. You're safe. My father insisted, walking with me around the house in the middle of the night. Flashlight flickering on the woodwork. But no ray of light could pierce the darkness of that dream world. And no rational comfort could erase it. After I learned about Uncle Brian, my parents' college friend who had babysat me, banned from them after some undisclosed disagreement, the fear shifted to something else, a cold, intense fear that perhaps those visits had never quite ended, that he might have called in my dreams when I was too young to fight back. Even now, decades later, I can't decide which is worse, that I dreamed about him so vividly, or that a man I barely remember could shape the architecture of my nightmares for years. Whether he was Brian or a stranger conjured by my subconscious, the window watcher remained the most haunting ghost in my childhood mind. Every time I passed a window at night, rain tapping softly on the glass, streetlights gathering into a halo of light, I glanced once, twice, as if I expected to see him there again. And though I no longer had that recurring dream, the memory of his silent vigil, the scar on his temple, and the scratching of those claws remained in the corners of my mind, waiting for my eyes to drift back. Because in my dreams, I am never alone, and neither. It was in the aftermath of that fourth nightmare, when I woke with a start at 3 in the morning, every nerve aching with adrenaline, convinced that the stalker's pale fingers were about to smash through my bedroom window, that I finally blurted out the whole thing to my parents. My voice trembled as I described the countdown clock, the grinning childish crayon drawings on the wall, the broken toy train that had somehow returned to my floor, and above all the silent man with the scar on his temple. His face pressed inches from the glass, his hands clutching the window as if he wanted to pull me inside. My chest heaved as I described how, each time, I would stand still in that dream, unable to scream, unable to move, even as terror wrapped its cold fingers around my heart. I remember my mother's gentle hand on my shoulder, her words both calm and warm. Dreams may seem so real, dear, but they can't hurt you during the day. My father nodded slightly in response, patting the back pocket of his jeans that always held his flashlight. Now, champ, he said, his voice low and even, make sure the walls of your castle are as strong as you think. In that moment, part of me felt relieved, finally someone believed me, while another part recoiled at the thought that my own home might not be safe. They led me down the hall, my small hand slipping into Dad's, and turned on the porch light. Together we examined every inch of the walkway, the concrete blocks surrounding my window, the neat strip of grass between the house and the chain-link fence, the bare ground beneath the gutters where tiny flowers bloomed every spring. I squinted, looking for footprints that would prove that someone had actually been out there. But all I found were the faint traces of fallen leaves and the faint shadow of my dad's own boots. Nothing, he said, his voice strained with unspoken concern. My mother circled the window, her fingertips brushing the sill and the brick beneath. But there was no smudge marring the glass, only the soft fingerprints of our last family cleaning. No scratches in the paint, no cracks, she whispered, almost to herself. He must only appear in your dreams. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Because if he was just in my dream, why was my heart still pounding hours later? Why was I still shaking even when I was lying on the warm blanket? 6. But darkness has a way of lingering right after the light. I lay beneath the covers, staring at a square of moonlight spread across the floor. It was larger, colder, an impossible intrusion into the warm safety of my room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The window was locked, wasn't it? I could feel the comforting click in my hand as I closed it each night. But here, in my half-dream, the window was gone. A wind whispered through the room, colder than any I'd ever felt before, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. My body shivered, a primal terror running through me, as I realized the stalker had found a new entrance. Those 5 minutes were carved into my flesh like iron claws. I remember the helpless rage, the silent scream rising in my throat. Let me move, let me move. My muscles burned as I tried to sit up, to throw off the covers, to run to that window, even though every fiber of my being warned me not to look. The air felt alive with menace, every breath tasted like ashes. I felt certain that, at any moment, the stalker would climb through the window, press his cold cheek to mine, and extinguish the security I had built around my dreams for half a year. And then, thankfully, I was wide awake, my limbs prickled with pins and needles, my spine numb, my heart sinking into a fear so deep I feared it would never go away. I rolled out of bed into the tantalizing darkness of my room, my trembling fingers tracing V-shapes on the carpet until I reached the window. I flipped the switch. The overhead light bathed the room in golden light. I stumbled forward, pulled the curtains aside, and looked. The glass was clean, the frame unscarred. There were no footprints on the windowsill, no shards of ice inside, just the familiar awning of the roof beyond. And yet, despite every rational cell in my brain screaming with relief, the fear remained. A heavy anchor in my chest. The next morning, I barely got out of bed. My father found me in the hallway, eyes puffy, hands clutching the covers. "Another one?" he asked. I could only nod. This time, when I told them everything, every detail, every horror, it was different. My father's face was twisted with something I'd never seen before, fear. Pure and unguarded. For me, he sat me down on the edge of the sofa, patting my back gently when my voice cracked. My mother, pale and stern, reached out to stroke the scar on my father's temple, the same diagonal line I described in my dream. I stopped mid-sentence, staring as realization dawned on me. They exchanged a wistful look, and my father swallowed. "We thought it might be Brian," he said softly, his voice beginning to say the forbidden name. He told me, for the first time, about the college friend my parents had trusted when I was too young to remember. About the rift that had kept him away and the barriers they had placed on his visits. The last pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Brian's scar. The blocked visits. The impossibility of his presence at my window, but he was there. Night after night, or in my dreams. In the days that followed, my parents swept the yard again, checked the windows again, and even called the police to file a report of the ghostly footprints and the wild dreams. But the nightmares never returned. I knew, though, that the real victory was not banishing the stalker, but bringing him into the light, finally naming him, and seeing the dreamscape finally lose its power over me. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake with a start, my mind ticking like an old clock, and I lie there until dawn, just to make sure the windows are locked, and whatever awaits. When the fifth nightmare came, it was not simply a series of strange images or random details. This time, it would turn into a completely real picture. I was awake in the special night, but not completely awake, because maybe my muscles were tied up. Like someone had used rubber bands to restrain all my muscles, all efforts to call out. The thin area was useless. If before I had only startled and sat up, this time I could not even move a finger. Although in my heart the sudden flow of current reached such a level that I imagined myself jumping off the mattress. The ticking of the clock seemed to echo through the sweaty body, despite the silence of the night, making me even more convinced that this was not sleep. At that moment, and then, in the midst of my fearful dream, I suddenly realized that I had reached the limits of terror. Then, miraculously, the next morning, I woke up, my eyelids heavy, still haunted by memories. As time passed, the nights that followed I no longer struggled with the dream. The clock ticked forward. The picture above gradually faded from my memory. I learned to lull myself to sleep with the sound of light rain and my mother's warm lullaby. But one thing never faded. The image of my first helpless resolution in the middle of the screen. When my body was bound differently than anything in the invisible box. When the knocking outside could have been real. And when the dream dragged me into the hopeless space of paralyzed sleep, where the stranger and I were the same sleep in sleep. The same silence. The same fear. I will never forget it for the rest of my life. A few weeks after the last nightmare ended, I still couldn't shake the fear from my mind. Every night when the night fell, I would close my eyes and wonder, will he come back? But that night, things happened in a way that still makes me feel scared when I remember it. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the wind breathing through the crack in the door. And then longed to see the room completely dark. It had never been so peaceful. Instead of responding to the report, I turned around and fell to the ground, my feet touching the floor, shaking but more determined than ever. A few years ago, I would have only sprayed deep under the covers, not sprayed up out of bed. This time, I grabbed the flashlight next to the bed, its pale yellow light with a hint of dew shining on the wall. Each ray of light making my heart pound, as if afraid that even a moment of lightness would cause the shadows outside to rush in. I walked step by step to the window, went down, used the flashlight to illuminate every centimeter of the window frame, and discovered faint, horizontal footprints on the stool outside the window. Okay, just a trace. But to me at that moment it was bigger than anything. The flashlight beam swept over each step under the dust, each moment resolving the tip of how many times I had dreamed of him. Hinting at the shadow carved deep in my memory. Hinting at the inseparable feeling of having my hair cut. I cupped my hand and ran, my fingers touching that trace, thinking I could lightly feel the remaining moisture, the slight coldness. My heart felt like it was about to break. I cringed and opened the window to make a call that had not been oiled for many years. The smell of iron mixed with the night wind rushed straight into my nose, making me nauseous, but that was also what made me know that I was not dreaming less. Under the lamplight, footprints were spread out on the stone platform, dotted with dry soil and leaves that were slightly shaking. I remembered the first night I told my mother, when he turned on the lamp and walked along the path and found nothing. I briefly believed that it was just a dream. This time it was different. Yes, that person had really visited the house, not just in my little dream. I folded the flashlight, gasped, listened to the wind breathing through the branches in the yard. I put my hand on the door. How many nights of fear had been concentrated on that moment? Under the running hand, closed tightly, not a single gap, not a single scratch on the glass. I suddenly realized that footprint could not have entered if the door had remained silent. If no one had opened it. An accident? A cruel joke? Or had he himself passed through the gap without me noticing? All fake. The thought of telling my parents made me cringe. I knew the end of this story would scare them so much they wouldn't be able to sleep. But I couldn't carry that scar under my pillow. The next morning, I woke my parents up in the rain and told them to come down to my room. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the entire floor was still wet outside. But my father's eyes knew right away, this wasn't my imagination. My parents were silent as I pointed to the footprints outside the window. My mother's lips softened, her eyes filled with tears, my father's brow furrowed, his fingers running over the dusty footprints. I recounted my night dreams, the image of the green roof, the picture of the stick and the lost toy ship, and ended with the final step, the footprints outside the door. I heard my parents' flutes, but I also heard in their voices, parents. I couldn't believe it when the technician said, he crawled under the crack, stepped lightly over the sill, left a trace, and then pulled out. It was a real shock. The person had climbed around the house, maybe even into where I slept, just to look at me. Not in a dream, in real life, the feeling of breaking apart, as if each layer of protection inside had fallen off, leaving only boundless emptiness. I fell to my knees, my hands clenched into fists, tears streaming down my face, and the fear was now heavier than ever. But perhaps, what made me most silent was not the footprints, but the understanding that every time I opened the door to tell my dream, every day I was safe behind the thick fur, which had been watching me throughout my childhood, waiting for the day I grew up enough to share it with my mother, waiting for me to no longer dream like before, then act. Handling this service, the police said that the person who had stolen money, no one expected Chian to break into the nursery just to satisfy a strange pleasure. I realized that the initial fear was only the beginning. Behind the dreams was the imminent danger. Step by step in the footprints outside the window, the sound of the wind, the yellow flashlight, the smudged footprints on the sill, all combined into a warning bell. The smallest signs could foretell disaster. I learned that sometimes the fear in dreams is only a small part of the truth, while the majority is out there, calling for help, affecting us when we are most awake. To this day, That footprint is still carefully kept in the evidence bag in the attic, the only memento that proves that it wasn't just a dream. Every time I look back, time still aches, remembering those nights, when I had just finished telling the story of the clock running backwards. The sticky picture, and the lost toy train. My mother suddenly took my hand, her eyes sad but determined. She gently said, "Can you be quiet and listen to your parents for a moment?" I looked at my father, saw his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes so anxious that I was exhausted. He slowly released himself and exhaled, pointing to the sofa near the window. "Sit here with me." I sat down forcefully, not daring to say anything more, because there was already. My mother put her hand on my shoulder, her anger like anger, then turned to my father. The electric light on the wall stretched the shadows of the two people on the old wood, creating a scene that was both familiar and somewhat dangerous. My father looked at me with a warm gaze mixed with a bit of pain. Then opened his mouth. "Do you remember, Uncle Brian?" I shook my head, the flash of the light on the deep scar. I stammered. I don't know. Mom and Dad." My mother bent down, gently stroked her hair, feeling at ease. "Uncle Brian is an old friend of my father. When he was in college. You're too young to remember. But Uncle Brian used to come to visit our family. At that time, I felt a warm breath rising up my neck. And at the same time, the yellow light was high. I tried to remember gently and tenderly. But the memory was only limited to the image of my parents' youthful appearance. The cozy house, and the other aspects were all blurry. My father continued. "Brian and I were very close. We played together since our 20s. Back then, I often let you stay at a friend's house. You cried when Uncle Brian came home, because he read fairy tales very well." I listened without feeling confused. Each memory momentarily flickered. Laughter. Sighs. My mother. My heart skipped a beat. "Say X." I burst into tears. "Correct. Since yesterday." The next day. The apartment I had dreamed of. Since then, every night I automatically say, "I am no longer afraid of dreams." I understand. Dreams are just a command to inform, to awaken attention to things that the family has hidden. However, deep down, I still carry a fleeting fear every time I remember Uncle Brian's shadow. But now, it only exists as a faint memory, a lesson in how to face fear, and how to grow up with the truth so as not to be silenced by the darkness. A few weeks after my parents told me about Uncle Brian, and the family secrets buried deep in my subconscious, I thought the fear had faded. I slept better, and no more dreams of the clock running backwards, the stencil, or the strange toy train appeared in my dreams. But one night, everything came back unexpectedly, leaving an unchallenged trail, leading me to believe that reality and dreams had merged in the most terrifying way. I woke up to the sound of a gentle breeze outside the window, as if someone had just inhaled deeply and blown it into the room. My legs jolted out of the covers, my waist drenched in sweat. Before I had time to doubt, I turned on the bedside lamp, its dim light illuminating the corner of the room. My heart gladly joined in a diluted internal current. No way, the dream is over. But my eyes were so nervous that I didn't relax my lids, afraid that a blink would send me back into the world of fantasy. I gently backed away to the foot of the bed, slowly walking towards the wardrobe, where I had seen sharp pencil marks all over. But tonight it was smooth, without any trace. Before answering, I turned to look at the window. The darkness outside became dense, the wings fluttering constantly. I made nature into my mouth, just the wind. My hands run to release the lantern. I turned on the phone and ran to call my parents. "Dad. Mom. Morning." I stood there, trembling. Parents are worried. The following days. January goes by. Month. Video. After some effort, I made the announcement. 2 months later. News. General thinking. Always like that. That night began like any other sleepover. 3 kids sprawled across the living room sofa. Rumpled blankets and a half-dozen empty pizza boxes stacked on the coffee table. The TV's dim glow flickering on our upturned faces. I'd fallen asleep somewhere around 1 a.m. after a series of video games. Convinced that the only real threats in that suburban California house, the one with the big windows and the neatly trimmed lawn, were a paper-thin mattress and my own snoring. Then, in the middle of the night, about 2 hours later, My dream was shattered by the unmistakable roar of running water coming from the upstairs bathroom. At first I thought it might have been someone's innocuous fall turning on the faucet. But the gurgling and gurgling of water sounded too deliberate, too persistent, like an invitation or a taunt. My heart pounded against my ribs. The sleep evaporated from my system as I sat up in the dark and fumbled for my phone. Even with the light of the screen in my hand, I could barely make out my two friends, Duncan and Ian, curled up on the other end of the couch, breathing steadily and unfazed. I snuck out into the hallway, barefoot on the plush carpet, and followed the sound of the waterfall up 3 shallow steps past my friend's half-asleep whispers. Toward the bathroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar just enough to reveal the outline of a simple white sink and a bathtub beyond. At first I thought water must be gushing from a burst pipe. Something in the metallic scent of the air told me this wasn't a plumbing problem. And then I saw it. One of the chrome faucet handles was on full blast, spraying jets of water onto the sink. My pulse was pounding so hard I could hear it in my skull. And a panic deeper than mere surprise hit me. Someone had to be in that room to turn it on. I crept closer, eyes narrowed to slits, each step calculated so that whoever was inside wouldn't hear me coming, if they hadn't already. When my eyes were level with the doorknob, I could feel the cold mist hitting my face, my shoulders shaking. The bathroom was easily 15 feet from the sleeping quarters, but it was so quiet in here that the splashing water sounded like a waterfall in a cave. Something deep inside me snapped, and I shouted down the hall for Duncan, but only the echo of my own voice answered. Adrenaline coursed through me. I still didn't know whether to call my parents. This was exactly the kind of false alarm that could get you into trouble. But as I reached into the doorframe, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of PVC pipe, the glint of pale hands, darting forward. Just as the door opened and a large figure lunged at Duncan, a flailing figure in dark clothing, I screamed. Time slowed. The intruder's arm swung back with the pipe, his face obscured by shadow, and he slammed into my friend, sending Duncan sprawling across the tub, clothes and water flying like debris from a tornado. My survival instincts erased any thought of my own safety. I lunged at my attacker, praying that my 15-year-old body could at least slow him down. We fell to the floor in a tangle of limbs. A desperate tangle. Blows rained down. I felt Duncan whimper and try to break free. But the man's grip was iron. His intent vicious. Call 911, I yelled, finally snatching the phone away. My thumb was shaking so much it took me 4 tries to dial. Meanwhile, I swung at the stranger with my other hand, hoping to break his concentration. Give Duncan a chance. But he was bigger than either of us, stronger and madder. As if he'd been waiting for this moment. Then everything changed. A sudden flurry of voices from downstairs, my mother's shrill screams, my father's bare feet pounding up the stairs. The intruder froze, his head turned toward the stairs, and in that split second of distraction, Duncan and I pushed him away. He staggered, dropped the tube, his eyes bulging with rage, and he dashed down the stairs. My mother appeared in the doorway, her face ashen, screaming into the phone, "They're safe! They're safe!" In an instant, we could hear sirens in the distance, a wail ripping through the winter air. The police swarmed into the house, sweeping every room, gently handcuffing us to check our pulses, then bursting through the door and onto the street in search of the attacker. Then the upstairs bathroom became a picture of devastation, 4 inches of water on the tiles, the sink bulging and peeling, towels ripped from the shelf and stuffed into the tub. The air smelled of chlorine and fear. My mother wrapped me in a blanket, the tremors in my body finally easing as tears rolled down her cheeks. Duncan sat on the edge of the tub, dripping and dazed, while the police took pictures, collected PVC pipes as evidence, tested the water flow, and interrogated us in calm, clinical tones that sounded strange after the chaos. We told them about the sounds, the faucet handles, the sudden movements, every horrifying detail. They checked the window leading to the hallway, noting that it had been locked from the inside, meaning the attacker had deliberately lured us upstairs before breaking in. No valuables had been taken. There was no apparent motive other than terrorism. As the sun rose on our quiet suburban street, the blue lights of the patrol car still spinning, I realized something chilling. Our home, once a refuge, had been breached not by a random burglary but by a calculated trap. I lay awake that night on my ragged mattress. The memory of the noise and the crash and the feel of wet tiles under my fingers replaying on an endless loop. The heartbeat in my ears. The hissing of pipes. My own screams. I could never forget. To this day, I hear the roar of faucets in my dreams. A precursor to the crash. A signal of impending danger. But more than that, I remember that, in that fearful hallway, my friend and I found courage we didn't know we had. We survived by pounding with such raw urgency that it burned. And while the memory still horrifies me, it also reminds me that, even in the face of deliberate violence, the human heart can rise in protective rage, and that, when called upon, when the last dawn broke through the darkness, I woke up with a feeling of euphoria, as if I had just passed through a long journey of tears and sweat. The imaginary nightmare was over. But it was at the moment when I thought everything was behind me that I realized the true strength I had been hiding. The belief in myself. The courage to face my fears. And the unconditional love of my family. The strange footprints on the windowsill. The sporadic sound of perfume. The faint silhouette in my dream. All became memories, containing, with the help of my parents, the police, and good neighbors, every security hole was patched. Window cracks were replaced with tempered glass. Motion-sensing lights were installed around the house, and surveillance cameras were placed throughout the front yard and hallways. I felt not only physically safer, but also mentally safe, no longer afraid that a mysterious night would drag me back into the storms of the unconscious. Every time I looked out the window, I saw only myself smiling in the reflection, not a stranger. The seemingly terrifying story finally had a happy ending. My family gathered in warm embraces. Laughter and group lunches returned, not without evening conversations. When Dad shared safety experiences. When Mom told me lessons about facing fear bravely. I told myself, if I ever had to face the nightmare again, at least I would know how to stay awake, know how to turn to relatives and suitable jobs, know how to trust myself too. From that experience, I have a few conclusions. Track and news on map, when there is. Share your fears with others. Don't let your worries bury you in your heart. Enhanced security. A door. A pane of glass. Or not. Footprints. Scratches. Always have a plan B ready, even if it is a nightmare. Dear readers, if my story has touched your heart, please click like to support the character, to give more motivation for honest sharing. At the same time, leave a comment below, share your thoughts, your own stories, or questions you want me to answer. And don't forget subscribe to channel so as not to miss